Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing security issues facing our world today. In today's episode, Dr. Christopher Sands, director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, discusses the state of Canada's relations with the United States. We get into the challenges posed by Canada's inadequate defense spending to its credibility as a reliable partner in the U.S Canada relationship, the evolving security landscape in the Arctic, including Russia and China's presence, and the implications for Canada's role in allied defense, as well as the evolving U.S China trade relationship, its potential impact on Canada, and how we can position ourselves as a strategic partner in critical minerals. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Sands, it's a privilege having you on the program today. Thanks for joining me. To what extent does Canada's defense spending, falling significantly short of NATO's 2% GDP target, challenge the perception of Canada as a credible and reliable partner within the U.S.-Canada relationship? And how might this impact the overall strategic calculus of our two nations?
Well, it's a complicated question. And I should say at first that Canada is hardly the only country in that category. And I think every president going back to at least Eisenhower has asked the allies in the NATO to spend more on defense. The Wales commitment is more recent, and now we've had the Vilnius meeting, which has suggested an even higher target, or at least using 2% more as a baseline. But in all of that time, Canada has made efforts, but it has rarely made an effort that was even close to what we were hoping for. I think that the defense component of our relationship, the security partnership, has a tendency to be one of the components of the relationship, but not the most important. For reliability, the U.S. is much more focused on Canada's economic policies, some of its foreign policy in terms of being supportive on other major commitments, because we've built low expectations into the cake. We know Canada has not and is not likely to make that target. So Canada, even when you don't make the target, is about as reliable as we expect. But as a security partner, not very reliable at all. And what I've seen over the years, which I think is, for me, the worst aspect of Canada not spending up money on defense, is that there's a kind of U.S. indulgence of this. Because at the end of the day, what matters for us with regard to Canada is that the Canadian territory not be used to attack the United States. You might remember from the Ogdensburg Declaration, that was part of what Mackenzie King was trying to guarantee. Canada would not be used as a vector for attacking the U.S. And through NORAD and other agreements, we've more or less negotiated the ability to operate freely in Canadian airspace, in waters of the Arctic, wherever we need to be. So I think what we have is a relationship in which we expect Canada to do very little, but we have Canada's agreement that we don't have to ask permission and we can defend ourselves over and around Canadian territory. So to put it this way, we need Canada, we need Canadians, but we don't need the Canadian government. And that's practical, but unfortunately it means that when it comes time to talk about anything to do with security, including the Arctic these days, the U.S. is likely to say, call us when you have some money on the table, because otherwise we don't want to hear what you think, because we really don't, because you have an opinion but no contribution to make, or not enough of one.
How does the strategic importance of the Arctic region, coupled with Canada's reduced military capabilities, affect the perception of Canada's ability to uphold regional security interests and contribute meaningfully to North American defense efforts?
I think the Arctic has gone through a very fundamental change following the invasion of Ukraine, because that prompted NATO to expand, including Finland and Sweden. Norway, almost from the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, has highlighted the importance of developing a NATO strategy across the Arctic. And they've been pushing very hard for this. But if you think about the Arctic's geography, Alaska, Norway, to a lesser extent, Sweden and Finland, are fairly well secured. The U.S. is well positioned and the allies are well positioned. But there are two parts of the Arctic on the NATO side that are difficult. One is Greenland, which Denmark does provide some security support for, but is largely secured by U.S. presence around Thule and so forth. And then there's the Canadian Arctic, which I think most in NATO recognizes the weakest link in our front. It is a very difficult territory to defend because it's so big, and Canada's domain awareness, let alone ability to respond if you were aware of a threat, is so low. For a long time during the Cold War, we felt that a combination of using nuclear submarines that had the ability to sort of move stealthily below the ice and could, surface if they needed to deal with anything in the region, and on the other hand, NATO and distant early warning and all the sort of the NORAD systems that we had pretty much gave us the coverage that we needed for a threat that we thought was bombers at first, and then maybe intercontinental ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. So we had created a kind of sustainable defense strategy for the Arctic. But now we're facing not only Russia, which is much better positioned across the Arctic in terms of equipment and capabilities, enhanced by China, which I think is maybe the most important new development in the Arctic. China has both the money and the technology to be a bigger player. And because of its support for Russia and the Ukraine war, it can more or less dictate terms to the Russians. The Belt and Road Initiative, which, to put a good face on it, was China's effort at creating an infrastructure link to markets in Europe and other parts of the world. They saw it as kind of their version of a Marshall Plan that would open up some new possibilities and make new friends for them. It hasn't gone very well. It's highly indebted. A lot of countries that they partnered with are resentful or don't want to pay their share of some of the infrastructure costs. So China's increasingly been looking at the North Sea route to substitute. And the North Sea route has one big advantage. You only really have to deal with Russia, and Russia can't say no right now. So I think China is looking to be more present in the Arctic. Combine that with Russia's already significant presence, and I think the Arctic has become a lot scarier than it was in the Cold War, a lot more risky. And so the U.S. and NATO allies are talking about what can we do to up our game, and that's the sort of new reality for all of us. Now, where Canada fits in is an interesting one. For a long time, Canada would respond to the concerns about Canadian overall defense capabilities by saying, well, we want to defend our homeland. We want to make sure that we're strong in North America, and we'll have a limited expeditionary force, for conflicts. But that's our strategy, and we know we're a partner, and we're going to try to pull up our socks and do our fair share. I think now the dilemma for the rest of NATO and for other countries is that there could not be a part of Canada's contribution to defense that's more important than the Arctic right now. And Canada is doing NORAD modernization. There are some elements there, but much more needs to be done. And if Canada cannot undertake those costs and take on those responsibilities for their own territory, I think the scenario you talked about, diminishing a sense of Canadian credibility, will become the narrative. That Canada is essentially put itself in a position of being a protector to the United States, and the U.S. is having to take on more and more of that burden, probably relying on some of the other NATO allies to do the same. But it'll be a sad day for Canada, and the hopes that Canada could be, in that sense, capable of defending itself and contributing to allied defense.
How would you assess the health of Canada-U.S. relations at present?
I think we're in a bit of a rut in the U.S. Canada relationship. And that's not to say good things aren't happening, but I think Canada has become very good at playing defense in a very divided Washington, avoiding having Congress come at them full strength, avoiding having the administration come at them, navigating disputes with states like Michigan over Line 5, the Enbridge pipeline, figuring out ways to manage the conflict. But what that results in is Canada not being forced to do anything that it wasn't ready to do. Meanwhile, the United States is highly polarized, very fragmented, power centers everywhere, and it's very difficult for the U.S. to kind of focus and be more than transactional with Canada. And then when we do try to be a little bit focused on an issue, Canada is able to keep us from focusing on that issue very long, playing defense. So the result is Canada-U.S. relations are increasingly a 0-0 tie, game after game after game. And I think some people in Ottawa see that as a win. Hey, we didn't lose, we tied. That's better than we expected. On the other hand, the Americans think it's boring. Let's keep playing 0-0. Let's find somebody else like the Australians in AUKUS or the British. Let's find somebody who's fun to play with, where we can actually get some things done. And I think that's where both our strategies are weak. I'm going to put most of the blame on the United States. We have gone from a point where it was our State Department, our Defense Department dealing with Canada, to a position where a lot of the relationship is in the hands of domestic policy departments and agencies of the federal government. And those departments and agencies are great and they have good people, but they no longer have that sort of State Department riding shotgun to explain, well, Canada is a parliamentary system, or in the Canadian Constitution, these things are provincial and those things are federal, like all of that detail, which is important in any international relationship. So we need to figure out how to better train and better equip people dealing with Canada across the U.S. government with resources to create something a bit more coherent. At the same time, I think Canada would probably be best served if it would try to get a win, or at least try not to always respond to U.S. offers with a kind of defensive crouch. Canada is a country that can play toe to toe with the Americans. That I don't think you're going to win every time, especially if we're deadly opposed. But I think on a lot of issues, Canada can do better than the way it's been doing. And so we're both in a rut. I think the U.S. is mostly responsible, but together we've got to figure out a way to get out of the rut. And President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau created their roadmap to a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership. I guess what I would say is that that's a good agenda, and I think it's terrific. But I think we need to go back to the garage and tune up our cars, because it's going to be a very long road. And I don't think either of our vehicles for policymaking are going to make the distance if we don't make some tweaks.
How's the U.S.-Canada relationship evolved under Biden's administration compared to the dynamics during the previous administration? And what key policy shifts or continuity can be observed in areas like trade, security, and environmental cooperation?
It's been surprising how the Biden administration has not fundamentally altered the trajectory that Trump started. I think there's a little bit different sense of the packaging, but a couple elements stand out. Both President Biden and President Trump have adopted a more traditional deterrence approach to defense. This is one that's very it's a little more popular in the U.S. than the fighting small wars and trying to turn countries into democracies strategy, which led to a lot of, unfortunately, dead Americans, and it didn't achieve its goals. Whereas the Cold War posture that we had, which was, we just will arm ourselves to the teeth so that no one will take a poke at us, that's very popular. It does mean you spend a lot of money. Americans are prepared to spend on defense, but it also means that you're really not fighting that much and you're not getting sucked into other regional conflicts. I think both leaders have found that to be the sweet spot for them. Similarly, Donald Trump, I think, pulled the Band-Aid off and showed that the trade consensus that had carried us from, say, Bretton Woods all the way through the end of the Cold War had really frayed. That consensus opened up our market as a way for developing countries to give up import substitution industrialization, for them to achieve scale economies and grow closer to the West. At the same time, that competition from lower wage countries and lower tech economies led the U.S. to seek to open foreign markets so that we could extend supply chains to places where we could get cheap parts. And there was no place better for that than China in the last, say, 20 years. And it was necessary because without those low-cost inputs, and given that we had relatively high-cost labor and investments in machinery, advanced precision tools, all that sort of stuff that we did in manufacturing, we would not have survived, let alone been as competitive as we were if we hadn't opened up. The problem with that is that although goods became cheaper, the purchasing power of ordinary Americans went up because you get cheap things at Walmart from China or Costco or whatever your favorite store is. Overall, people's sense of their future, their livelihood, where they saw the economy going had eroded. And so there was a backlash against trade. It was not particularly a backlash against Canadian trade. Canadians pay their workers, roughly comparable. You're not seen as a cheat. You're not stealing intellectual property. It's true that sometimes the Canadian government plays fast and loose to create a little bit of an advantage in competition with the U.S. And so sometimes we have an argument over that. But by and large, I think Canada is seen as a fair trading partner that will weather all of this kind of trade turbulence. The problem is really everyone else. And the Biden administration gave up an opportunity they had in the first 6 months of their term to rejoin what's now the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then lost trade negotiating authority. So the Biden administration has no ability to negotiate new trade agreements without going back to Congress. And Congress has been relatively skeptical of whether it's a request to go back for a WTO reform or anything else. And although the U.S. is talking about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework now as a kind of SPP light, that's long on rhetoric, short on details. And Canada and Mexico, having been beaten to a pulp by by Donald Trump back in the day, at least now have kind of the lucky position of the last trade agreement for a while from the United States, and that has secured some trade access, which heading into 2026 will be fascinating. That's the mandated review of the USMCA or CUSMA in Canada, and we'll see. I don't see a re-elected Biden administration, or frankly a Trump administration part two, really doing much to make that agreement more robust. My secret fear is that Donald Trump will suddenly decide that it's the worst agreement ever again, and we'll go through a whole nightmare again. But generally on trade, Canada's in a pretty lucky position and is benefiting a little bit from our attempt to rejig supply chains, and whether you call it nearshore, ally shoring, there are lots of different terms out there. We're definitely seeing some of that benefit Canada.
You bring up Trump, despite his many legal challenges as of late, he still seems to be the front runner for the Republican nomination. So I'm not sure if we want to wade too much into predictions here, but what do you think are the odds he gets back in the White House? And if there is a Trump presidency part two, does this have any significant impact on Canada and Canada-U.S. relations, or can we not really say too much about that at this point?
Given the choices that we have now, neutral of the personalities, we're likely to have a very elderly U.S. leader. And the challenge with both Donald Trump and I think Joe Biden to some extent is that their political careers, their sense of global affairs was really built during the Cold War period. And you can see frequent hallmarks of that old-fashioned way of looking at things creeping into their way of thinking. But also, I think both have been really challenged to understand modern supply chains and the way we live now, the way we work now. You see that in the debate about Huawei technology or TikTok. Say what you like about Justin Trudeau, but he is a bit younger, a bit more modern. And I think the U.S. is suffering from relatively older leadership, but also older leadership on top of a very polarized electorate, where I think it's fair to say a lot of people don't trust the Washington inside the Beltway crowd. And you've been around a little bit. When have we ever trusted the Washington inside the Beltway crowd? And I'm part of it. So, people don't really think Washington has the backs of ordinary Americans. And there's a little bit ancient history, but I can't resist it. Back in the 80s, Jean Kirkpatrick at Georgetown wrote a very important essay on totalitarianism versus authoritarianism. And she was making a distinction that is a little bit subtle and doesn't always translate politically, but that was that the U.S. had authoritarian allies, whether it's Marcos in the Philippines or you name it. We had lots of them, Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, etc. But those authoritarians were the lesser evil when compared to totalitarians who wanted to control every aspect of people's life, what they read, what they ate, what they bought, who their friends were. And I think that we're in a weirdly totalitarian place in the United States, where everything you do is politicized. Now, the vast majority of Americans that I know try not to think about politics, but politics creeps into everything from your kids' schools to where you go on vacation to normal political things like tax policy. But every aspect of identity is sort of pushed into this extreme agenda or a set of agendas, and we're fighting on the margins, not coming together in the middle. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges going into the next administration. You might remember just a couple months ago, the Congress agreed to lift the debt ceiling, which is one of our little, I don't know what you call it, kabuki dances that we do periodically to scare everyone half to death. The economy is going to fall apart. But when we did it, it was really interesting because the final agreement that Congress came up with was attacked by the conservatives in the House and in the Senate, and it was also attacked by the Progressive Caucus that in both chambers. To me, and I realize I'm very old, that's good news. When nobody likes the answer, like the fringes are out there saying it doesn't go far enough, it goes too far, that means the middle kind of rallied and came up with something that is imperfect but a compromise. And that's the kind of thing we need to see more of if we're going to navigate what is a relatively dangerous world. And to be hopeful, both parties agree that China poses a serious threat. Both parties agree in the main that Ukraine is a fight we have to support because Russia has acted out of bounds in terms of international law, etc. Both parties agree that trade should benefit Americans and we should be out there exporting the world. We're not isolationist. Neither party really is. There are a few individuals, but not in the main. We want to maintain our social programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. You can kind of come up with a list, and it's funny because you look at this list of all the things we agree on, even that we need to address climate change. Some argument about the solutions, but that is very much part of the middle. And you say, well, gosh, the United States is not that polarized after all. Most people are in the middle, and that's what's easy to forget. And what I'm hoping is whoever wins the next election and whatever the complexion of Congress is, it really is capable of rallying the middle where most people are. And becomes over time a bit less responsive to some of the more extremist voices. And I'm being bipartisan about that because there are definitely hotheads on both sides.
As the U.S. China trade relationship evolves and China's share of U.S. imports declines, how might this shifting dynamic impact Canada's own trade relationships with these two global economic powerhouses?
So I think there's a huge opportunity for Canada, but the biggest problems in Canada-U.S. relations come from two reflexes that we have. Canada's desire to obtain room for maneuver, to negotiate, to pay as little as possible for as much as possible. And on the American side, our tendency to take Canada for granted and to think, well, Canada's there. What are they going to do? Who else are they going to go to? And so we don't make the effort necessary to sometimes win Canada over. And it creates this dynamic in which we're both disappointed in each other. I'll focus a little bit on industrial policy. Because I think it's a good example of that. The Biden administration, with the support of Congress, has created a historically large amount of money that it's pumping into the economy in an attempt to get the economy to move towards climate action and new defense capabilities and other things ahead of where the market would normally have gotten to those things. So the government is in a hurry. It sees the hurry coming from external risks, and so puts money on the table. Unlike industrial policy of the past, say in the 1970s and 1980s, it isn't picking winners in the economy and saying, we're going to create a national champion, we're going to use this to have these people carry us forward. It's all incentives, which you can come and claim if you meet the criterion, and then have at it, see what you can do with the money. Not only is it not picking winners, it's also not necessarily focused solely on the United States. We've seen Canadian companies that have applied to have some of the subsidies for developing projects, including things like critical minerals, advanced battery technologies, and so on. And yes, the U.S. does like the jobs associated with that to come to the United States. We've seen some of that as well. But the response that the U.S. has to Canada saying, hey, you're putting all this money in, what about us? What about us? Is your companies can participate. And if you want this activity on your side of the border, open your wallet, spend some money on your own. We can work on this together. And I think Canadian leadership has sometimes waited for the gift. When is America going to just open its wallet for us? And what the United States is trying to do is move in a hurry and just wants Canada to step up, and assumes that whether Canada does or doesn't, we're going to be fine because we take Canada for granted. So to me, that's kind of the jam that we're in with regard to China. The U.S. is determined to decouple from China, and it's determined to fight the sort of Chinese attempt to create leading industries in several areas of technology. It is one of the ways in which we're playing hardball in terms of global economics, and we haven't seen this against a major power really. Even in the Cold War, because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union wasn't a major trading partner. We had very few economic relations, although we did have some IP stolen. That was about it. So in this situation that we're in, I think it's moving away from China is a huge opportunity for Canada to be a partner of choice, but it's going to have to step up and not sort of wait for the handout, but instead say, how can we be strategically valuable? Now I'll give you an example because it comes up a lot, which is critical minerals. When the U.S. indicated that it needed alternative supplies to critical minerals, Canada responded with a critical mineral strategy, which I think is very smart. Canada's critical mineral strategy identifies that Canada does have some critical minerals, mainly in the south. It has critical minerals in the north as well, but the extraction cost by some estimates is 2.5 times what it would be, in the South, and that's if you build the infrastructure to connect to it, which is also super expensive. So I think Canada's reluctantly realized that it has those things, but it's not going to be able to bring them to the market anytime soon. So Canada's critical mineral strategy involves developing what you have in the South and focusing on processing. Processing is really important. That's where China's advantage really is. They do buy the minerals globally, but then they process them, and it's that processed form that we need. Processing most critical minerals involves concentrations that are quite toxic and dangerous. And so it's in our interest as sort of Western open democracies that processing occur in a place that has high standards and good regulation, because otherwise, the potential damage to people and to the environment is serious. So Canada has taken this position that it is a safe market in which to invest. It provides the right regulatory framework. It should be where critical minerals are processed for all of the West. And you, of course, have space for that as well. It's a big country, which is an interesting response to countries like Chile and Argentina that have said, hey, we have a lot of lithium. We have some cobalt here. Canada says, sure, great, mine it, make some money, but sell it to us. We'll be a little higher on the value chain, and we'll supply the North American market and the European market. For Canada to pull that off, it's going to take a little bit more than just pointing out that you have an advantage. It's going to take some salesmanship. I haven't seen that yet from the government. I think there's a little bit of expectation that the U.S. is going to come in and bless the strategy so that they don't have to persuade anybody because the U.S. said it was okay. I think Canada's probably going to have to make that work on its own, because the U.S. isn't going to rely solely on Canada. It's going to develop other places where it can do the processing so as not to be hostage to any market. But that doesn't mean Canada doesn't have a shot. It just has to be able to really rally. And we haven't seen that yet, but we could certainly see it. And I think there are enough people in the Canadian government and in Canada generally who've got the vision to maybe get you there.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next time.